All right. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. This is the Texas Dialogue on the next decade of climate action. I hope you're all staying safe and staying away from each other in this crazy time. So a little bit of background of this event is there are 50 or so other simultaneous webinars going on right now across all 50 states around the country. And this is Texas's one. So we have some wonderful speakers for you today. Dr. Katharine Hayhoe, who's in the red shirt. Mr. Ben Hirsch, who's in the yellow, and he'll be having another person join us. And then Dr. Jim Crane from the Baker Institute will be joining us as well. So the format of how this is going to go is I'm going to have a quick intro video first, and then after that we'll have the three panelists speak, and then after that we're going to have about 15 minutes for questions, which you can type in the chat. So I'm going to go ahead and play this intro video. And hopefully this is working.
Welcome to Solve Climate by 2030.
Hey, James, I think you better just stop the video.
All right, sorry about that. Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. Okay, I sincerely apologize for that. But just the video it's a intro. You don't really get to see it. Let's get started with Dr. Hayhoe speaking, if you're ready.
Sure. Welcome, everybody. It is fantastic to see so many people here. Hopefully you can hear me okay now. We are live. I am an atmospheric scientist and a professor at Texas Tech University. So we are really covering the whole state with this webinar. And I want to kick it off by talking to you about why, when it comes to climate change, Texas is ground zero. People often ask me, you know, why are you in Texas? Isn't it difficult to be a climate scientist in Texas? And while sometimes it certainly is, there are tremendous opportunities to being in this state as well. And I wanted to share some of those with you now. So let me share my screen with you. Here we go. And I'm going to start this up. All right. When it comes to climate change, here are 4 reasons why Texas is ground zero. Number 1 is probably the one that you already thought of. We produce more carbon than any other state. Now, the flip side of that, if you're a glass half full person, is that means we have the greatest potential to reduce our emissions too. When you look at every state, I know California here is the same color as Texas, but when you look at the actual numbers, we are definitely ahead of California. It's not only our carbon emissions, though, it's the fact that we also produce as much or more oil and gas than any other state as well. So we have the furthest to go. The second reason why Texas is ground zero is this, and this is what I study in my own work. Our state is more vulnerable to climate and weather disasters than any other state in the country. You may say, are you sure about that? I am, and here's why. First of all, wherever we live, we know that we are at risk from normal weather, right? We know that there are ups and downs, there is hot and cold, there is wet and dry, and if we live in Texas, we know it looks more like this. We had, for example, in August 2018, if you can think back a year and a half ago, almost 80% of the state was in drought, just as an example. And then by the fall, Central Texas was experiencing its wettest fall on record. Conditions here change so fast, they give you whiplash. We get floods, we get drought, we get wildfire. And in fact, here it is, it really is official. When you look at the map of the number of weather and climate disasters that have caused at least $1 billion worth of damage since 1980, Texas is number 1. We have had more of them than any other state because of our geographic location. We get pretty much everything. We get storms and floods and hurricanes and ice storms and hail and tornadoes. We get pretty much it all. And why do we care about that? We care about it because the number one way climate change is affecting us is by loading the natural weather dice against us. What do I mean by that? Well, we know that we always have a chance of just rolling a double six by chance. That's a hurricane, a flood, a heat wave, a big storm. We also know that if we live in Texas, we already have 3 6s on our dice naturally. So how does climate change come in? Decade by decade, as the world warms, it's like it's sneaking in and taking one of those numbers and turning it into a 6, and then another 6, and then maybe even a 7. And before we know it, if we're living in Houston, we're like, hey, we just had 3 500-year flood events in 3 years. What's going on? Climate change is loading the dice against us. Specifically here in Texas, it is making our heavy rainfall events stronger and more frequent. It is making our heat waves in the summer stronger and more frequent as well. Ironically, it's also when our droughts come, as they always do naturally, our droughts are stronger because the hotter it is, the more water evaporates from our soils and our reservoirs. And then there's hurricanes. Now, hurricanes are not getting more frequent. They aren't. But there's a lot more rainfall associated with them today in a warmer world because warmer air holds more water vapor. So when a storm comes along today, and hurricanes are very big storms, there's a lot more water vapor for them to sweep up and dump on us today than there was 50 or 100 years ago. And in fact, with Hurricane Harvey, it is estimated that 40% of the rain that fell during Hurricane Harvey would not have happened if the same hurricane had occurred 100 or more years ago, like the Galveston hurricane from 1900, for example. We also know that hurricanes are powered by warm ocean water, and the oceans are warming. They're causing storms to intensify a lot faster. They ratchet up from a tropical cyclone to a category 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 a lot faster. More of them get to a higher category these days, so there's more of them that are stronger. They're moving more slowly, so they can dump more rain on us. They're also getting bigger, so they cover more area, and of course, sea level is rising also. After the hurricane decimated the island of Dominica in the Caribbean, the Prime Minister of Dominica said this. He said, "To deny climate change is to deny a truth we have just lived." But we could equally say this right here in Texas. So what's the third reason? The third reason why Texas is ground zero when it comes to climate change is the fact that many of us don't agree with the science, although many do. A new poll that was just released a few months ago by the University of Texas found that although most of us agree that climate is changing, over 70% of us would say, yes, it is getting warmer. Why we think that's happening and what we think we should do about it is split along partisan lines. Let me just give you 2 examples. Example number 1, do you think climate is changing? 66% of us would say yes. But when you split it out, it turns out the Republicans are at 44% and Democrats are at 88%. Then if you ask people, just a second here, how much should the government be doing about it? 47% of us think they should be doing a lot. But if you break that out by political affiliation, Democrats are 79%, Independents 41%, and Republicans 18%. So it is ground zero when it comes to the political polarization of climate change, as well as the impacts of climate change, as well as producing carbon emissions in oil and gas. So what's number 4? Number 4 is the good news. And here it is. We here in Texas have the solutions at our fingertips. We know that we're already famous for wind. We know that our state has more wind energy, according to the American Wind Energy Association. We have more wind energy than any other state in the country. If you click on Texas here on this map, here's what pops up. The number of wind projects that we had, the amount of wind that we were generating, the wind energy potential, the fact that we're powering 7 million homes, and the fact that there are over 30,000 jobs in clean energy. When you look at the installed wind capacity across the country, you can see huge concentrations in Texas and in Iowa. But we don't often think about other ways to get or save energy, like efficiency. Did you know that when they estimate which state could save the most by simply becoming more efficient and less wasteful in the way we use our electricity, Texas is number 1. We have the potential to save more energy than any other state, as well as having more wind energy. And we were not even on the map for solar energy 10 years ago. But today, Texas is already climbing the charts. We are already in the top 10 states for solar. And a headline from just a couple of weeks ago, or sorry, back in December, said, solar is expected to disrupt the Texas fossil fuel apple cart. Specifically, Texas is expected to double its solar output next year and the year after that. So we could soon be number 2 or 3 easily in solar as well. Now, when it comes to solar, people often say, yeah, but we don't have the area for solar. We don't have enough space to put all that solar up. Anybody who says that has not been to West Texas. Because if you go to West Texas, I have calculated how much area it would take to cover with conventional solar panels, not new school, just what we have today, how much area it would take covered with solar panels to supply not only Texas's electricity, but the entire country's electricity. And here's what that looks like. Oops, sorry, there we go. Here's what it looks like. It looks like a square that's about 100 by 120 miles square. I would like to point out that Elon Musk and I both calculated this independently, and we came up with similar numbers. In fact, there was a really interesting figure that was produced a little while ago showing what area of land we use for what purpose around the US. And for solar energy, if we're going to supply the whole country with solar energy, and of course we don't have to do that because we also have wind, we have efficiency, we have more. If we were only going to use solar energy, it would be the same area as is currently used for golf or maple syrup. That's how much area it would be. So I calculated this and I put it on Twitter, and I said, people worry about how much land we need to supply the US with clean energy. Well, Elon Musk and I have independently calculated it, and we both come up with something roughly comparable to the area we currently use for maple syrup or golf. And here's the proof. He replied, and he said, good analysis, although a little conservative in my opinion. He probably has new technology that I am not aware of. However, using a high upper bound, that is a tiny percentage of the US area. That giant fusion reactor in the sky called the sun outputs a truly staggering amount of energy. So that's why number 4 is the best part, because the solutions are right here in our hands. We have the first carbon neutral airport in North America, DFW. We have the biggest army base in the US, and it has been powered exclusively by wind and solar energy for 2 years, saving taxpayers millions of dollars. We have entire cities going green. We have more wind power than anywhere else in the entire country. And we are competing at the national and international stage with countries like Morocco that have the biggest solar farm in the world, countries like the UK that have the biggest offshore wind farm in the world, and China, which has more wind and solar energy than any other country in the world. As John Holdren, President Obama's former science advisor, said, he said this. He said, looking to the future, we have three choices. We can reduce our emissions, that's mitigation. We can prepare for a very different future, which we're going to have to do anyways because we can't avoid all the impacts, or we're going to suffer. And we're going to do some of each. The only question is what the mix will be, because the faster we cut our emissions, the less adaptations required, the less suffering there will be. And Texas has a huge role to play in making sure that happens. Thank you.
Hey,
Thank you, Dr. Hayhoe. I meant to give her a nice introduction before she talked. So I just wanted to point out that this is the thing I've written down. Dr. Hayhoe is an accomplished atmospheric scientist, studies climate change and why it matters to us here and how. She is also a remarkable communicator who has been named to a number of lists, including Time Magazine's 100 Most Influential People, Foreign Policy's 100 Leading Thinkers, and Fortune Magazine's World's 50 Greatest Leaders. So I just wanted everyone to know how incredible it was that she was talking to us today. So thank you, Dr. Hayhoe. We'll have time for questions for her later. Next, we have Mr. Ben Hirsch and Ms. Doris. Ben is a community organizer and policy advocate for the grassroots disaster recovery organization, West Street Recovery, based in Houston, Texas. He is a graduate of the University of Texas, LBJ School of Public Affairs, and his interests are poverty and the environmental and alternative structures of government. So Ben is going to talk to us with him, and it's going to be some sort of dialogue. So take it away.
yeah, James, do you mind unmuting Doris? Or are we in this same
Yes.
cycle? Okay, awesome. Doris, can we hear you?
I don't know, can you?
Yes, excellent.
Yes.
Okay. So Doris and I are both wearing these Northeast Action Collective shirts. And the Northeast Action Collective is a small group of people just like Doris who has been an absolute inspiration to work with for the last, how long have we known each other? Maybe 2 years at this point, about 2 years. And I'll just tell you that I'm going to let Doris talk a little bit about her neighborhood and the impact of climate change on her neighborhood. And then I'm going to try to put it in a little bit of context of what Catherine Hayhoe said. But we both are members of the Northeast Action Collective, and we're both part of West Street Recovery, which are organizations, both of them are in Houston. So we hope to hear from you guys in the future. But Doris, why don't you just tell us a little bit about what your neighborhood is like and what the impact of climate change is going to be on your neighborhood, and what are some things you're worried about?
Well, I'm worried about, we stay over here in the industrial area. And for years, the emissions from those oil and gas, whenever they have an explosion or anything like that, it seems to waft over this way. And we just, for years, we have protested this, and we're having all these explosions and everything, and our neighborhood floods. I don't care, heavy rain, it floods, and has always did it. The drains, they don't even bother to clean our drains. I guess it's our socioeconomic poverty over here. I guess that's what we are. We never see a politician or anything until it's time to vote. They promise, come in here and promise us all this, that they're gonna do this, try to alleviate and mitigate flooding, and it never happens. The only time we ever get any help is when we get out and do it ourselves. And that's why we had to band together and come up with the Northeast Action Collective. It's a bunch of us neighbors, communities that came together in order to fight this. We're tired of just being left out. We want to know, when are we going to have more equitable use? For years, it's just going on the same thing over and over again. And we're tired of flooding. We're tired of inhaling all this pollution. You can't even see a star in the sky because we live in a haze over us. And the children are coming with asthma, born with asthma and stuff. And it's just all kind of respiratory diseases we're suffering with over here. And it's just, no one seems to be doing anything. No one seems to be counting us in as potential getting us any kind of help. That's what I'm trying to say. So.
Yeah. So I think what Doris is laying out really, really clearly is that if you live in a neighborhood like Northeast Houston, which is it was originally a Jim Crow segregated neighborhood where only African American folks could live. Now it is, segregation is maintained through other means, in terms of it's a more polluted area, it's more flood prone. So if you have a lot of choice in where you're going to live, you're not going to choose to live in a dangerous and polluted area. So it ends up with concentrations of people who have the least power. They have the least power in our society. And what I think is important to know when we talk about climate change is that climate change, it's not just that people that are the most impacted by climate change will be marginalized people, will be poor people, people of color. It's also that climate change itself reinforces that marginalization. So for example, Doris has built up wealth in her house over her lifetime. But when she gets flooded, all the wealth that she has been built up, it's all destroyed through no wrongdoing of her own. And at the same time, the great wealth and prosperity that were generated through burning fossil fuels, people like Doris and in Doris's neighborhood have received the least benefits from that. That's not to say that they haven't had some benefit living in an industrialized society in the developed world, right? But Katy or Memorial look very different from Mesa and Tidwell or Mesa and Homewood, which is where Doris lives. So I just want to really quickly show you guys, oh, this is confusing. How do I do this? I'm going to show you some pictures of what Northeast Next Door looks like, because I think it's really important for people to know, what does it look like when you do organizing? And what it looks like is this. I am going to try to show my screen here. I'm not sure it's totally working. Can you guys see my screen?
Yeah, okay.
Doris, can you see it? Because you're the only one I can hear right now. So this
can
is
see it.
us. This is us meeting in a house. This is what building power looks like. And this is what we're going to need to do a lot of. We're going to need to adopt the strategies that Dr. Hayhoe has suggested on a large scale. But we're also going to need to build local power to make sure that the transition to renewable energy is a just transition. And this is pictures of us doing what Doris said, which is creating that change for ourselves. One thing that we noticed was the drains are not maintained in Doris's neighborhood. So a little bit of rain, which would be dealt with easily by a modern drainage system in a black and brown neighborhood, it sits in people's yards. That degrades their foundations, it degrades their house over time. And this is a picture of us literally cleaning out the drains ourselves. We had about 100 people that came out last May, and we conducted this project to clean out the drains. And I just want to show these pictures because this is what it looks like when communities show up for themselves and when they get support to show up for themselves. And I think that it's really important to know that that's what's going to need to happen, or else we're going to do the really good work that Dr. Hayhoe has suggested, but the benefits are going to be distributed unevenly, just as they always have historically.
Always.
So that's basically our thing. And what the last thing I would like to say is that the current frameworks for making change in our society don't necessarily have the capacity to deliver the kind of change that we need. So when we do environmental justice organizing, it's really about trying to shift culture and shift the way people talk about these problems and the way they understand the problems. And it's also about taking care of each other, because we know that we're suggesting a massive transition which will be very disruptive, which is to end the use of fossil fuels, and that we're going to have to figure out ways to take care of each other in our communities that can sustain us as we do this really difficult work. So that's basically our spiel of who we are. And I think it's important to know that people like Doris have been excluded from the biggest conversations about our strategy as a society of what we're going to do. And if they continue to be excluded, they will be again left out in being considered when we make the solutions. So I think it's on everyone to try to make sure that we're actively working to include people like that and to learn from that wisdom. I don't know if Doris, if you have one last quick thing to say. It seems like Dr. Jim Crane got here, so.
Yeah, I just want a more equity for Houston. I just want some help for our neighborhood. I need to know what part will we play in the big picture. When will someone come ask us or try to help us help ourselves? That's it for me.
It's a great point for us to end on, I think.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hirsch and Ms. Doris, for speaking for us today. Our last speaker today is Dr. Jim Crane, who's just joined us. Dr. Crane is the Wallace S. Wilson Fellow for Energy Studies at Rice University's Baker Institute. He was recently named the leading energy think tank in the world. His research addresses the geopolitics aspects of energy with a focus on the Middle East and OPEC states and their political and economic strategies. His scholarly articles focus on energy subsidies and demand, as well as internal politics and exploring states. He teaches classes on energy policy and geopolitics at Rice University. So Dr. Crane, take it away.
Well, hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah, coming through okay? Okay, hey, sorry I'm late. I must have gotten the time wrong here. But regardless, I'll just charge ahead here. So I look, as James said, I look at climate change from the perspective of oil exporting countries. So I look at, how it might affect a country that's really dependent on oil, especially countries in the Middle East, big oil exporting countries. And the one I focus on the most is Saudi Arabia. So I look at these countries around the Persian Gulf. A lot of them are monarchies. Most of them are autocracies, at least. And for them, climate change is really kind of a lose-lose proposition, right? So if you think about it, the first one of those propositions is, what if climate action succeeds, right? So if climate action succeeds, they worry that their economies are going to tank, right? So if Saudi Arabia, and the other Gulf monarchies get about 80 to 90% of their government budgets from oil revenues. And they stay in power, these governments stay in power by basically distributing oil revenues as a form of patronage to basically buy public support, right? So if the world moves away from oil, then that political model falls apart. But on the other hand of that lose-lose proposition, if climate action fails, then they're also in trouble, right? So, if it succeeds, they're in trouble with their economy. If it fails, they face warming temperatures that could render some of these countries, at least some of their coastal cities, virtually uninhabitable, or actually in reality uninhabitable for parts of the year during really high temperatures in the summer. It's already really, really hot and humid in that part of the world. So it's not, this isn't something that's unique to oil exporting countries. It's unique to, climate, weather stressed countries already, especially around, equatorial countries. But, for these countries, their main industry is behind the threat, right? So it's, it's kind of a double whammy. So there's some research out that shows that some of the coastal cities in Iran and Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, they could, at high levels of continued emissions, they could get so hot that healthy humans would actually die. You'd be killed from prolonged exposure to that kind of heat sometime by the end of this current century, right? So within the conceivable ruling spans of some of the current young crown princes that are you know, on the cusp of taking power. So these countries basically face a major dilemma, okay? And it's different for them than it would be for oil producers in northern latitudes like Canada, Russia, or Norway. They don't face this same kind of lose-lose, dire choice dilemma. For them, climate damage is probably a longer-term concern. But so the obvious answer that they hear and that they're looking at is to diversify their economies and reduce their reliance on oil. However, for them, there aren't any businesses that provide the consistently or persistently high returns that oil provides, right? So this is for various reasons. Oil just happens to be an extremely profitable business, especially for these guys, right? So Saudi Arabia produces oil for about $8 a barrel, sells it for whatever the going price. I mean, that happens to be about $25 right now, but normally it's $50 to $60 to $70 or $80 a barrel, right? So in 2018, their returns were roughly 80% returns on investment. So these countries could move into, let's say, renewables, but the returns would be a tiny fraction of that, right? They'd be about 5 to 10%. So can the Saudis or the Kuwaitis or the Emiratis finance their expensive monarchies on that kind of those kind of returns? Well, probably not. Not in the same way that they're doing now. I mean, they could probably these ruling families could probably stay in power, but they'd have to do so by either cranking up repression or opening up their societies to democratic participation. Neither of those is something that the governments want to do. So right now they're looking at sort of half measures, I guess you could say. They're trying to reduce the emissions from their oil businesses and then maybe offset some additional emissions by through carbon capture and storage or other ways of sequestering carbon. So let's just shift that to us here in Texas, where I am. I'm in Houston. And so for us, here in Texas, it's kind of a similar story. Okay, we've got, we've had this fracking and shale oil revolution, and oil and gas have again gotten to be a really big part of the Texas and Houston economy. About 10% of the direct, the economy is based directly on oil, and about 30% indirectly, in Houston, maybe a little bit less than that statewide. So climate change for Houston is a similar lose-lose proposition, right? So, the economy depends on emissions-intensive industries, oil and gas, refining, petrochemicals, liquefied natural gas exports, et cetera. So climate action would inflict pain on that part of the economy. So does anything that reduces the oil price, including right now the virus pandemic we're seeing, right? And just like Saudi Arabia, Houston is on the front lines of climate damage, right? We've had, crazy amounts of rainfall and flooding, and the rising temperatures are driving up folks, the electricity demand. So it's, that similar dilemma here. And I think, like some of the rhetoric that you hear in Saudi Arabia and the International Climate Fora, Houstonians feel a similar way. They feel that they would have to pay a disproportionate price for a climate solution. So a lot of people here seem to think that the price for decarbonizing the Earth and the atmosphere would be worse than actually just putting up with climate change, right? So a lot of folks here are loath to talk about it and they ignore it. Now that is starting to change, and we're seeing some action here. There's a sort of some initiative for carbon capture and storage. There's some talk about carbon offsets, but it's just starting really. So how do we proceed from here? I think, well, the lesson that I'm trying to get across here, I guess, is that oil is an extremely profitable business and during most time. It's not right now, I guess, but mainly it is. And I think executives in the oil and gas industry are really unwilling to change their business models until something changes to make it less profitable, or until some kind of policy forces their hands, right? So, so something that makes oil less attractive on a commercial basis, like a carbon tax, perhaps, might help in a relative sense by making other energy businesses look more attractive, okay? So what you ideally need, I think, would be high prices for consumers to discourage consumption, at the same time as low prices for producers, okay? So you'd need, for something like that, it's, you never have high prices for, you don't have this different prices in that way. You'd need a carbon tax or something like that to try and accomplish both those things. And if you had something that really discouraged investment in oil, you'd probably see a lot of movement into other businesses. There's a lot of engineering expertise in Houston and Texas, and a lot of geological expertise. Those things are useful in some of the renewables business, especially offshore wind, or in carbon capture and storage, et cetera. So with the right structure and the right incentives, I could see Houston and Texas diversifying beyond oil probably more quickly than Saudi Arabia. So I guess I'll leave it there. Hope that's okay. Again, sorry I was late, and thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Crane. That was wonderful. So the rest of the format of this event is we're going to open up to questions. There's a Q&A box down below. Dr. Hayhoe has also already been answering a lot of questions. You can look under the answer tab. But I'm going to field some questions, and we're going to open up to the entire panel. Just let everybody talk. The first question I wanted to ask was directed to Dr. Crane. How does the recent decline in oil prices affect anything like a carbon tax? How would it make it less effective? Is it still a reasonable proposal? And how long are things expected to be this low?
You're muted, Dr. Crane.
Got that? So, I mean, one way of looking at it right now is the perfect time to impose a carbon tax, because fuel prices are extremely low, okay? Now, you would get absolutely no traction in Washington right now because, the Republicans and Democrats are united in trying to stimulate the economy, right? And they would, imposing a tax now would be, it'd just be a non-starter, right? You'd be laughed out of Washington trying to do it now. However, with oil and gasoline, diesel prices so low right now, I mean, some states they're under $1. So what's going to happen if they stay that low? Well, as travel restrictions are lifted, people are going to drive more. They're going to buy more gasoline. They're going to trade in their Toyota Prius for a Chevy Suburban, and they're going to, so you're going to get an even less efficient economy. Oil price, falling oil price makes oil and gasoline more attractive. People consume more of it, and emissions go up. So you'd like to have a carbon tax in place to prevent oil and gasoline from being, getting so attractive that that people start to get, to get less efficient and start wasting it, et cetera. So probably now is not the perfect time, but once folks start getting back to work and the economy starts recovering, it would be a great thing to have on the at the ready.
Can I say one thing about that, James? My first thing is, Doris, what would the impact be on your life if gas prices went up? What does it mean for someone with a very low income to have gas prices go up? Like, how would that impact you?
That would mean that I couldn't go as much as I would want to. Being on fixed income, you just don't have that privilege to just fill your tank up. You put a few dollars and go here, and it would limit me significantly.
What if gas prices were at the same level that they were before the COVID-19 outbreak? So what if they were around $2.50 a gallon instead of about $1.75?
Well, when it was 250, we went very little. I wasn't able to fill my tank up, but now I can. And really and truly, when it's that high, we don't have the money or the resources to continue doing what we would like to do. We can't have our meetings more. We can't, our activity life is still limited with higher gas prices. And with the diesel fuel and stuff, it smells up our neighborhood. My breathing becomes kind of constricted.
The only reason why I asked Doris that, and I think that there's this idea, it's a totally prevalent idea that we can solve these problems through market mechanisms. And a tax is a market mechanism. It's a way of playing with the market. And I just think we will probably need to use all the tools available. But I think it's really important to remember that when we use price as a mechanism, the way it impacts me and the way it impacts Doris are completely different. And so if we're going to have a just transition, we need to use prices as a way to change behavior in the short run. But in the long run, that means the wealthiest people are going to be able to pollute the most because they have the most money, which at the beginning of the problem, it is really the same people who got wealthy from burning the fossil fuels that will then have the money to continue to burn fossil fuels. So I know that's a little circular, and we definitely do need to do things in the short term, and prices might be that thing. But I think it's really important that we expand our imagination beyond the market as like a way of tackling this problem.
So there's a lot of people have expanded their imaginations to be beyond this, and so if you look at carbon tax proposals that are there's actually some that have been drawn up and they're already on the books in Congress, where, or at least it's proposed legislation. Some of these are revenue neutral carbon taxes, where so the government would raise incredible amounts of money depending on how high that tax is, and then you'd have, since it's a regressive tax, as you point out, right, it impacts the poor more than it impacts the wealthy. They would, some of the proposals out there are for redistributing,
right,
either 100% of the proceeds, or at least some portion of the proceeds, right? And doing that on a means tested basis. So to take, as you correctly point out, this regressive tax and turning it into a more progressive policy, right? So I didn't mention that when I brought it up, but you got to do something with that revenue, right? So you can, and it's a regressive tax, so you'd want to do something to adjust that and make it more progressive.
Maybe build some wind farms and solar arrays too.
So that's another one of the proposals, right? So using that for for zero carbon sources of energy, investing in that, or for R&D. So there's a lot of proposals on how to construct a carbon tax, and most folks don't even want to call it a carbon tax. I mean, actually, the founder of the Baker Institute, former Secretary of State James Baker, is one of the proponents of this revenue neutral carbon tax, and I saw him. We had Barack Obama coming to speaking at our 25th anniversary gala last year, and I saw Secretary Baker, and I said, "Oh, Secretary Baker, how's your carbon tax proposal going?" And he goes, "Don't call it a carbon tax. It's a I forget what he calls it. A fee and dividend plan." So, but it's for all intents and purposes, there's a tax involved.
All right, I think we've run about the course on that question. Dr. Arroyo, you've been answering plenty of questions in the comments right now, and I was wondering if there was any of those you'd like to spotlight and talk about.
Sure. So just a reminder, if you have comments or questions, please put them in the Q&A. I've disabled the chat now because we can't keep track of both. So please put them in the Q&A alone. There were a couple of questions that I want to focus on and provide you with some resources as well. Just a second here and let me get this on my screen. Okay. So a lot of people have been asking, could you share some of these resources with us? And while I don't share my slides, what I do share is this recording. So this is going to be recorded and you can access it and share it. And we also have a series called Global Weirding. You can find it easily by just Googling it. It's on YouTube. It's called Global Weirding. It is done with our local PBS station here in West Texas in Lubbock. We have 2 special episodes on the coronavirus pandemic right at the top. And we also have an episode on Texas. The episode on Texas covers a lot of what I talked about in my talk. Just a second. If I Google Global Weirding Texas, it'll pop right up. Here it is. Texans don't care about, there we go. Texans don't care about climate change, right? That covers a lot of what I talked about. And we also have episodes on renewable energy. So a couple of people brought up the questions of, well, aren't there a lot of downsides to renewable energy? So for example, wind turbines kill birds and bats, and solar energy requires expensive ingredients that you have to get from mining. And in some cases, manufacturing solar and wind turbines, of course, actually produce carbon emissions too. All of those are true to some extent because there is no free lunch. But what we have is a lunch that currently costs trillions of dollars. And by that, I mean the economic impacts of climate change driven by fossil fuels, versus a lunch that costs a fraction of that. It is not free, but it costs a fraction of it. So for example, in terms of the carbon emissions or the greenhouse gas equivalent emissions associated with manufacturing solar or wind versus how much energy you get out of it, typically they break even after about 6 to 8 months. So that's how long it takes before you're saving more greenhouse gases than you use to produce the power. And then in terms of birds, it turns out that while it makes absolute sense to not locate wind turbines in migratory bird pathways, the Audubon Society, and you can see the link in my answer to Yvette's question if you go to the Q&A, the Audubon Society specifically and explicitly endorses wind energy. Why would the Audubon Society do that? Because they know that fossil fuel use and climate change have orders of magnitude greater impacts on birds than wind turbines do. And in fact, if we're concerned about all birds in general, rather than just migratory birds, especially songbirds, it turns out the #1 killer of songbirds is your outdoor kitty. Yes, we have a cat, he's very cute, but he doesn't go outside. Because if he goes outside, he's gonna be getting those birds, and they are the #1 cause of bird deaths in the US. So there is no free lunch, but there is an extremely expensive lunch, and there is a much cheaper lunch, and there's ways to make that lunch even cheaper. For example, with Elon Musk using renewable energy to generate the solar panels, as well as accurately siting the turbine farms here in Texas and elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question I had is, climate change is oftentimes framed as a societal problem, but we often look for individual actions we can take. I was wondering if any of y'all would like to speak on what we can do as individuals, but also things we should be pushing for from Texas in the near-term future to make meaningful action. So I'll open that up to anybody.
I'll take a first stab at it, and then I would love to hear Jim's perspective too. So we are often told that if everybody stopped eating meat, or if everybody stopped flying, or if everybody stopped having children, that that would fix climate change. Now, granted, if we all stopped having children, that would be the end of the human race. So in a way that would sort of fix it, but not in a way that most of us would find acceptable. But the truth is this: when we look at who is responsible for the changes in climate so far, 90 corporations are responsible for 2/3 of emissions since the dawn of the industrial era. And although the concept of a carbon footprint or an ecological footprint was created by people who care about the environment and ecology, it was popularized, the idea that we each have a carbon footprint, which we do, and the idea that we should be responsible for it, which we should, but it was popularized by a huge and expensive and well-funded ad campaign by British Petroleum in the 1980s. Why is that? It's because we absolutely need individual change. We eat much more meat than we need to. We don't think carefully about how we travel or where we fly. We're very inefficient and wasteful with our energy and our food. If food waste were its own country, it would be the number 3 emitter after China and the US. So there are absolutely individual things we can do. And I try to do 2 new things every year, myself personally. But I know that the single most important thing that I can do and that you can do is this: talk about it. Talk about the risks, talk about the solutions that are good for Texas, and advocate for change at every level, in our family, at our school, at our church, at our business, at our city, at the state level, and even at the federal level. It is so important to advocate for change at every level, from one individual up to the level of the world.
Hard to argue with that. So I guess from a Texas perspective, I think something that is really in play right now, and that, and actually where public comments are welcome right now, is on this debate about flaring of natural gas in Texas. So there is a lot of oil and gas production in the Permian Basin in West Texas, and in the Eagle Ford Shale in South Texas, and elsewhere around the state as well. But there, and a lot of the companies that produce oil in those basins, the economics for their business plan is based not around the natural gas, but it's based around getting the oil out and getting that to market. And so the regulator, the Texas Railroad Commission, which does not regulate railroads, but it regulates oil and gas. The Texas Railroad Commission has allowed these companies to basically flare as much gas as they want, as long as they want to. Okay, so it has since 2008 not denied a single request for an extension or a permit to flare off natural gas. That's basically burning the gas that you produce. So when you produce oil, it comes up. It's almost like Coca-Cola, right? It's got bubbles in it, and the bubbles, it's not carbonated, it's methaneated or whatever. So there's a lot of methane in it that mixed in bubbles that comes to the surface. And normally, when you have a responsible company that wants to capture and market that gas, you capture the gas and put it in a pipeline and send it to market, where it's used for, you burn it to make electricity, or you make it, petrochemicals out of it, et cetera. But in Texas, it's viewed as a waste product because the price is so low. Companies don't want to; they want to get the oil out, but they don't care about the gas. Their economic model is based around oil. So, state allows them to flare it. But this on the 14th, the Texas Railroad Commission is holding a hearing. Then this subject is hopefully going to come up. So there's some talk about reducing production of oil in Texas, and the Environmental Defense Fund is hopefully going to get a chance to speak. And this is how they are arguing that, and actually we at the Baker Institute have been saying the same thing, that rather than just cutting production, sort of generally across the board, it's the companies that are flaring, or even worse, venting natural gas, just letting it vent to the atmosphere, that they should be the ones that cut production, because there's as much gas being flared in Texas. The amount of gas being flared in Texas would more than cover all the residential use in the entire state. It's about as much gas as used in Austria or in Vietnam. Okay, it's more than the gas used in power generation in the state of Massachusetts, right? So it's a ton of gas being flared off. So
that's a very shocking statistic that I had no idea about, Jim. So the amount of gas being flared in Texas would be enough to supply all the natural gas we use in the state. Is that right?
Residential demand.
Residential demand.
So
okay.
Like for cooking and heating.
And heating. Well, so Richard has a question I think ties directly into that. He said, I heard they're flaring because they have too much, and instead of being able to sell it or provide free power, they just burn it off. Is that true? Accurate representation?
It is. So, I mean, to me, it's like, you know, you should not be allowed to produce oil if you aren't going to, you know, if you don't have a mechanism available to take, you know, if you don't have takeaway capacity for the gas, right? You don't have a pipeline, you know, a connection. So it would almost be like the equivalent would be you'd be allowed to build a house or a neighborhood without a sewer connection, right? I mean, you know, you wouldn't allow a builder to do that, and you know, I mean, so it's and there are regulations on the books prohibiting this. They're just being ignored. So just enforcing regulations already on the books would go a long way.
So I just related to both those things. I think that one thing in terms of individual actions is that we need to start building political power, because these are actually political questions. They aren't technical questions. Like Dr. Hayhoe can outline the technical solution to providing all the energy that we need. It's not actually a knowledge deficit, and it's not actually a technical problem. The problem is a political and a social problem, and it's really about our values and our goals as a society. So where I think it's really important to say, like, flaring the gas is completely irresponsible. And Dr. Crane's 100% right. I think if I was going to say an individual action that people should be doing, it's really about how can you build political power? How can you build coalitions? How can you build movements? And how can you make sure that people that aren't normally included are included in those movements? So one thing is Doris actually just went to Washington to testify, to lobby really Congress members for flood mitigation infrastructure, right, Doris? Oh, I think, yeah, there you go. You muted yourself.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, we went to Washington to lobby Congress about the climate change. It was 3 hours from Texas. We went there and we talked about the golf course that they did. It was Bio City Works, and it was me. So we had to get our Texas congressmen, see how they felt about the climate change, see if they would be a part of it. And most of them agreed, and they were supposed to have been, you know, but then COVID came, so I don't know. I guess they put it on the back burner, but I continue to call and try to get in touch with them and see if they're still trying to do something about it. So I have not heard anything yet, because we went for the Wildlife Federation. So I'm still on that. And then, you know, we still on the railroads about that creosote and that methane gas and stuff. So.
yeah, Doris is also fighting the Union Pacific Railroad, which has left a massive creosote deposit in the 5th Ward, which has the highest cancer rate of anywhere in the state. And I think that what's important about that story is that it's really a group of neighbors that were calling attention to this problem for years. And they were really dismissed. They were dismissed by lots of people. They were dismissed by Democrats, and they were dismissed by Republicans. They were dismissed by the federal government and the company itself. But after building enough power and building enough alliances with other advocates, with environmentalists, with housing justice people, and just building that momentum, they finally are getting some attention to that problem. And I think it's going to have to be all of us doing that in our little ways, on our little issues that are actually, global warming is kind of overwhelming because it's global. But the creosote deposit in your neighborhood, or the flood that happens in your neighborhood, or the smoke from the refinery in your city is something that you can tackle and really look at. And if we all solve those little problems, we'll be going a long way to solving the big problems. That's what I would say is you have to do politics if you want to do environment, unfortunately.
And there again, your voice is your greatest weapon often.
Totally.
Well, so there's actually a couple of questions about this that I would love to get people's opinions on. So Diane said, this is a question for Jim specifically. So what is the opposition to a price on carbon that has bipartisan support? It has the support of the Climate Leadership Council, which was created by, you know, AT&T and Ford and ExxonMobil. All the big energy companies have at least on paper said they support carbon pricing. Nearly every economist in the world, including the two who won the Nobel Prize for Economics a year and a half ago, say that that's the most effective way to reduce carbon emissions in a free market. And in my own home country of Canada, we had a price on carbon in 4 provinces for a few years, and those 4 provinces led the country in economic output before it became a federal policy. So Jim, if you could concisely summarize, what is the political opposition to a price on carbon?
You know, as far as I can tell, well, there's, first of all, the big loser in a price on carbon would be coal, right? So the coal industry would be, I mean, they're all, you know, with cheap gas already running them out of business, a carbon tax would seal the deal, right? So the coal industry would be dead in the U.S. In fairly short order, right? And so then it would make, you know, so you think about what a carbon tax would do. So it would make natural gas more expensive and less competitive relative to wind and solar and nuclear, right? So the, you know, zero carbon power generation, and it would make you know, less efficient vehicles less attractive to relative to more efficient ones, right? So if you think about the you know, the levels of profit that, you know, Ford and GM make on their pickups and SUVs, pretty high level of profit, right? Those are expensive vehicles, and they, you know, that's really where their profits come from. They don't make much on the smaller cars that are more efficient. So it, you know, I think there'd be a lot of opposition from you know, the fossil fuel interests, right? Now, if you talk to oil companies about their preferred, you know, a way of addressing climate, I think they, you know, they would prefer to see a carbon tax over other, you know, capping trade or, you know, you know, stricter regulation. I think they'd like to see that, so that, but, you know, I don't think they want a carbon tax, you know, because they think it's something that they, you know, they desire. I think it's just that it's compared with the other ways of you know, mitigating carbon, they see the tax as they're probably the least you know, troubling one. And for oil, I don't think a carbon tax probably wouldn't have a huge dent on oil. I mean, oil is a transportation fuel. The other two fossil fuels are more power generation fuels, and there's a lot of competition in power generation, right? There's substitutes for coal, and all of them are cleaner, but there's also substitutes for natural gas, and some of them are cleaner, right? For oil, there really isn't a substitute for oil. You know, there's electric vehicles on a small, you know, on a tiny margin. People are willing to pay a lot of money for transportation. You know, think about, you know, the cost of airline tickets, et cetera. So, and the, you know, cost of a vehicle. So, and if you go to Europe, if you know, the gasoline is, you know, close to $10 a gallon in some countries, right? So, people are, and they still drive cars, right? So, transportation services are really valuable, and so I think the oil companies are confident that a carbon tax wouldn't really hurt them that much. I don't know why this bill hasn't passed. With all that said, right? It makes sense. It allows, you know, folks to find the you know, most cost-effective path to reducing their emissions, but why you know, why that's not good enough? You know, I mean, I don't think the president wouldn't sign it. And, you know, there's the way the politics is now. I think, you know, Republicans probably worry someone would get voted out of office. They'd have a primary challenge from the right, and they'd get shut down. So that's my guess.
Well, there is a bipartisan climate solutions caucus, which we can post the link to here, where you're only allowed to join as a Democrat if you join with the Republicans. So it is 50-50. And the whole idea of that caucus is to give Republican legislators kind of a cover of having, you know, a couple of dozen fellow Republicans who are with them in promoting a bipartisan solution like this. Now, you raised a really good point, Jim, which relates to a question by Phil here. Phil asked about nuclear energy, and you raised the point that a price on carbon wouldn't only make wind and solar cheaper, it would also make nuclear cheaper. Now, Phil says, could nuclear energy be a better financial way to fix the problem? Well, the challenge, Phil, is this. First of all, it's primarily only for electricity, and electricity is just part of our energy use. And the reason why we don't have any new nuclear these days, there hasn't been any new nuclear built in the US in decades. The only attempt to do so in the Southeast US was actually just, they pulled the plug on it a few years ago. There's one reason. Cost. Nuclear energy is currently, conventional nuclear energy is currently the most expensive way to generate electricity. But here's the thing, there absolutely is innovation happening there, and a price on carbon could help spur innovation. Like what? Well, there's this thing called micronuclear that they developed at Idaho National Labs, and they're rolling it out with a company called NuScale, NuScale, in Oregon, to see if modular mini nuclear could be more affordable, more flexible, and more safe. And in fact, a headline I just read was kind of funny. Rolls-Royce, that's the car company in the UK. Rolls-Royce is actually planning to build 15 mini modular nuclear plants in the UK because the UK has really stringent carbon goals, and so they're more financially incentivized to support clean energy. What I want to do, though, is I want to emphasize this. When it comes to climate change, there is no silver bullet. There's no one thing that will fix everything. But what we do have is we have a plethora of solutions. And one of the best resources on that, I'm showing with my screen right here, it's called Project Drawdown. You can find it online at drawdown.org. I'll add the link there to the chat box. And they go through all of the different solutions, some of which are ones that you would think of already, like solar energy and wind energy. But some of them are things that you might not have thought of, like bamboo production to take up carbon from the atmosphere and composting. And if you go all the way down to N, there's nuclear power right there between net zero buildings and nutrient management. So there are a plethora of really positive, constructive solutions. And talking about that portfolio, I think, is really important because it will empower different people to act in different ways. So I want to turn to a different question here and pose this to Ms. Doris and to Ben. And that is a question about here in Texas, how do we, and this is Larry's question, how do we raise the level of constructive bipartisan discussions? You guys have had a lot of discussions, it sounds like. So what is your secret to having constructive bipartisan discussions in Texas?
Oh, Doris, you want to go first?
We go out through the communities and we get opinions. We let everybody, our groups, we use that model of, you know, where we don't have a leader. Everyone does input. We get together and we discuss it, and we take it, you know, we use the same model in all our groups. We all get together, we discuss it. We have built Facebook pages, we did Instagram, so we let the public know what we're about. We try to, we get more members like that, and we have people that join us on this. So we discuss it, and then we form a plan and we implement that plan. You want to take it from there?
Yeah, sure. So I would say two things. One is what Doris is saying about trying to understand that many people have really good ideas and understandings of their own life, especially, and that we always try to start with people's lived experience and people's material reality. Because there's a lot of agreement on a question like, isn't it terrible to live in a neighborhood that floods? Like, no one is going to disagree with you on that. It's a material reality. And what that does when you let people do that is you build trust, right? Because you're validating someone's perspective and someone's experience, and that creates space for openings. But what I would say also, in terms of the idea of bipartisanship, is that our politics, which are definitely ruled by partisanship at this moment, are also sort of restrictive in this way, where certain types of criticism are off limits and certain types of cooperation are off limits, which is why this having a Republican and a Democrat join at the same idea is acceptable, right? But I also think when we have a question about bipartisanship, we have to take questions of white supremacy, of homophobia, of xenophobia and racism really seriously. And I think there is a question when you're trying to build, you know, a movement for a better world, is like, who actually is at a point where they are ready to be part of that coalition, right? Like, if you're if your belief about the world is that you have to oppress other people in order to be powerful, then you're not ready for the step into the next world, into the better world that we know we need. So whereas we are very motivated by environmental issues, I think that we have a much broader conversation that actually, I think, opens the door to a lot of people who wouldn't consider themselves Democrats or Republicans, which is maybe 50% of America is like pretty checked out of the political process. So we think a lot it's about engaging those people and meeting their material, starting with the material, starting with like, what is your house like? What's your neighborhood like? And building out from there. And that's really the path to cooperation. So we hope we're right.
Well, that actually feeds directly into a couple of questions. I'm not going to read them all, but they all relate directly to this type of issue, which is, what about the issue of what we call a just transition? So in other words, the fact that we do have a lot of jobs in the oil and gas industry here in Texas. There's a ton of them in Houston. And just as the world no longer uses horses and buggies, in 50 years, the world is not going to be relying primarily on burning fossil fuels for its energy. But how are we going to ensure not that the fat cat executives with the 7-figure salaries, but how do we ensure that the average person with a GED degree who's working out in West Texas on the Permian Basin oil fields, or somebody who, it's just, they have an office job or they're an engineer and they work in the oil industry, how do we ensure that there is a transition for them? So the fact that we are trying to wean ourselves off fossil fuels doesn't mean suffering for others. I would love to hear everybody's perspective, because I feel like Jim has kind of a macro perspective on this, and you, Ben and Doris, you have a really micro perspective. And let me just share my own personal story first. So a year ago last Christmas, I mentioned how every year I like to do 2 new things. So, whether it's getting rid of the freezer and reducing food waste, or whether it's getting a plug-in car. But a year and a half ago, I had already done my 2 things that year. And then just before Christmas, I got one of those dreaded emails that says your credit report has been pulled. And I was like, oh no, somebody's like identity theft or something's going on. So I said to my husband, I think there's a horrible problem. We have to lock down our accounts. Somebody's checking out my credit record. And he said, oh no, don't worry about it. I said, what do you mean don't worry about it? He's like, I know about it. I said, what do you mean you know about it? He's like, well, I can't tell you. I said, why can't you tell me? He's like, well, it turned out that for Christmas, he had done all the research and he had figured out that we needed solar panels. But not only that, he found a company in San Antonio, Texas that manufactures the solar panels called Mission Solar. And when oil prices last fell, not this time, but the time before, and when all of the guys working in the oil fields out in West Texas lost their jobs, Mission Solar in San Antonio took in a bunch of them and retrained them to do solar panel manufacturing, which is a permanent job right here in Texas. And that's who we got our solar panels from. So I love that in that small way, we were able to contribute to that just transition. But bigger picture, why don't we start off with you, Jim? Bigger picture, how do we consider transitioning the state's economy?
Well, I'm not sure I have the answer for this one, but I did look a little bit into salaries, comparing salaries in the oil business with those from renewable business. And again, it's just less attractive from a salary standpoint, right? I mean, the oil industry has, with these returns that they make, they have cash available for lobbying and for sponsoring research and for lots of other spending, and large salaries to attract talented engineers and executives, right? So the renewables is just a much more competitive industry, and that competition tends to drive down returns. I mean, that's what it's helping to compete with fossil fuels, and by making it ever cheaper, and the people that take those jobs that are on those lower salaries are one of the key reasons that you've got solar and wind now competing with gas pretty handily. But if you are somebody who's used to $120,000 salary, what you're going to get in the wind or solar industry is going to be more like 50 or 60 or $70,000, right? So it's not like that for everybody. I mean, folks, that sell those systems. If you're a person that's in sales and you're selling big wind farms and doing big deals, you can make a lot more than that. But but you don't see the same kind of largesse, you know, from wind companies in lobbying or in sponsoring research or you know, some of the other things that they, you know, bankrolling candidates, or, you know, they don't put forward their own candidate for the Texas Railroad Commission, et cetera. So it's you know, again, I mean, it's tough to find, you know, to compete with the oil business. Now, if the oil business becomes less profitable, then again, that makes the other ones look more competitive on a relative basis. And when folks who are actually working in the fields, I mean, those jobs are typically kind of temporary, almost like gig economy jobs. You hear about them driving for Uber in their downtime. I mean, I've gotten picked up by Uber drivers who work in West Texas, or they go deal blackjack in Las Vegas, or, you know, they go to, you know, ski. They work in a ski resort, or, you know, they take those kind of, typically those types of jobs.
I would mention, though, that for the last 5 years, according to the National Bureau of Labor Statistics, the #1 fastest growing job in the whole country for the last 5 years has been either wind energy technician or solar energy technician. And while the pay might not be as good as the 6 figures that you get with a GED degree working out in the oil fields in the Permian Basin, it's stable. You're not going to be fired or let go. It's better living conditions. There absolutely are trade-offs. Okay. Ben and Doris, just transition. Tell us your thoughts.
Yeah, Doris, why don't you start? Like, when you think of a world after fossil fuels and like a you know, a peaceful and prosperous world, like, what does that look like to you?
It looked like cleaner air. I'd be able to walk out and see stars. My grass would be greener. The kids that come, they wouldn't suffer with asthma and everything. Everybody would be driving a Prius or an electric car. And maybe, just maybe, it would trickle down to our neighborhoods. We would have, you know, it wouldn't be a cloud hanging over us. We would be able to have some of the things that everyone else have. We'd have retention ponds to stop the flooding. Someone would come and clean our drains on a regular basis. Our input would be valued instead of just washed aside, you know, so.
And I think that Doris brings up a really good point about the just transition, which is a fossil-free world will be more just. Fossil fuel production involves, like, across the world, involves a lot of repression and oppression, like in Saudi Arabia. And it also, a lot of instability in terms of booms and busts, which are generally not very good for marginalized people. And I think that there is some justice in just doing the transition. But I also think Doris brought up some important things, like retention ponds and someone cleaning her drains. And I also want to say that there are 17,000 people in Houston who've applied for the city's home repair program, and only 53 have received any sort of assistance after 2.5 years. There's a lot of work to be done in our society, which is not being done. There are elderly people in their houses isolated. There are children without food. And my point being, not that somehow going away from oil will solve all those things, but that if the question is, what are all these people going to do for jobs? Well, there's one great example would be like, how about repairing homes of people who are living in mold? And if the question is, well, how is that going to be paid for? I think we've seen in the last 3 weeks that when there is political will, you can pay for just about anything.
Mm-hmm.
Really, the money exists. You know, we are in a situation right now where there's a global pandemic and the richest person in the world is starting a GoFundMe to pay for his employees' sick time. And that's because the political will to demand that money back, it doesn't exist. And I learned this week that FDR during World War II created a 95% tax on any capital gains over 8%. Okay, so this is the guy considered the greatest president of all time by many people, or, you know, very good president. I know there are some conservatives that think the New Deal is some distortion of democracy or something. But all I'm saying is this is actually in our political past to do things like this. and it can easily be in our political future, and that there's so much work to do. So if the question is, what are these jobs going to be doing? And another thing is, if we go away from fossil fuels, some jobs will actually require more labor. And that is not a bad thing. We have structural unemployment. So having community gardeners, having someone on your block whose job it is to produce some food for poor people that live in your neighborhood for free, that's a great thing that would be part of a just transition. And I think that what's hard is to imagine a better world. And I for lots of reasons, we all have to go about our life and navigate the world that exists. So we don't get a lot of time to do that. But I think there's a lot of work to be done that has nothing to do with energy production. I think a lot of it has to do with care, and that is connected to sort of structural sexism, in that care work is considered non-economic work that women are supposed to do at home. And there are all these ways in which oil production and other types of oppression are connected. And so I just think that there's a lot of work we could do in a just transition to get to the world Doris imagines of, like, having a livable, nice neighborhood.
And that actually ties directly into a question I think Stuart has asked a couple of times, which is, what are the co-benefits? So this is really important because 20 years ago, there was a paper published by a scientist called Luis Cifuentes, who calculated that according to the health costs and the economic costs of burning coal, because coal is the most inefficient and dirty way of getting energy we have, according to those costs back 20 years ago, there was no reason to be using coal at all, none. So why are we still using it today? It's because those reaping the benefits are not those who are paying the price. There's a profound disparity. Around the world, 9 million people die from air pollution every year. 9 million. In the United States, 200,000 die from air pollution related illnesses every year. That is orders of magnitude more than the coronavirus pandemic. It is not to discount the devastating impacts of the pandemic in any way, shape, or form, but it is to say that somehow we have become blasé or callous to the fact that we are paying 200,000 lives every year for our fossil fuel use. And when you look around the world, the countries who are suffering the greatest impacts from a changing climate in terms of drought, insecurity, flooding, and more, those countries are the ones that have contributed the very least to this problem. So the benefits of reducing climate change are manifold. In fact, for the United States, in the National Climate Assessment, we calculated that based on the economic impacts in only a very limited number of sectors, just a few of them, not the whole economy, but based on only the economic impacts in a few sectors versus the cost of the US as a whole meeting its Paris Agreement targets, we would break even in about 10 years, economically speaking, let alone the fact that we would be reducing much of the pollution that, if you include air and water and soil together, causes 1/6 of all deaths around the world. So the co-benefits are enormous. And I think this relates directly, it feeds directly into a question that Jim got from Larry, and this is probably the last live question that we'll take. What about the co-benefits of financial investment? We've actually seen a lot of big investment firms like BlackRock announcing that they were going to divest from, BlackRock's divesting from coal. The Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund is divesting from new oil and gas exploration. This country of Ireland is divesting from fossil fuels. Microsoft has announced that it's going to be not only carbon neutral, but carbon negative by drawing carbon out of the atmosphere. So Jim, if you could take Larry's question, what do you think are the financial benefits of fossil fuel divestment?
Gosh, I don't know. I may have to just come at it from I don't know if there's financial benefits from divestment. I mean, just saw the, oil company stocks have been getting hammered, for the past 10 years, and they've been beaten way down. So it's been pretty apparent that it's a bad sector to invest in until like yesterday when they took a huge jump, right? So, but I think longer term, there's if folks that are investing for the long term, and they especially funds like, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, for example, the Norwegian economy is already based on fossil fuels. If you're already exposed to climate risk in your national economy, or if your business line is already heavily exposed to that. You don't want to be overexposed to it, especially now. And some of the fossil fuel sectors are more exposed than others, right? Again, oil does not have a viable substitute yet at this point, in transportation. So oil is probably less so. But there are a lot of divestment campaigns. There's also the entire insurance sector that is a very it's kind of on the other side of the climate argument from the energy sector, in that they aren't, they have a financial stake in seeing that the climate action does proceed, because their payouts are getting bigger and bigger because for all the severe weather events that they have to pay out. So they've been divesting. And they've been divesting from fossil fuels, especially. And there's all, the shareholder activism that, folks don't want to, balance their retirement on the backs of future generations, right? So there's sort of the ethical side of that. I don't like to talk so much about the financial side. I'm not an investment advisor. I know that there's definitely long-term risks to your company. If your company's business model has governments, individuals, and companies, actively seeking to overturn it and find a substitute for it as fast as they can. At some point you're probably going to face some risks, but how when those risks are materialize, I don't know. There's one other question on here I wanted to answer real quick before handing it over here.
Do it quick so we can have our last statements.
Oh, sorry, Brandy.
Yes.
The Citizens Climate Lobby might be what you're looking for. You said you're looking for something where you can, a bigger platform for your voice to email legislators and Congress, et cetera. So that might be a good one for you. Sorry.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. I'll put the link in there. Okay. So thank you everybody for joining. You guys have been fantastic. We had dozens of questions. We had well over 100 people on at various times. This is going to be recorded and shared, but I want to give everybody the chance. If you could just kind of, one sentence or two sentences at most, what would you like to leave people with? What thought would you like to leave people with? And I would like, if you don't mind putting on the spot, James, I would like you to start because you are the organizer of this entire event. So if you had people leave with one thought, what would it be?
Well, I wasn't expecting to be put on the spot here, but I don't know. I really hadn't thought of anything. I think I would want to echo Dr. Hayhoe's point. I think this is a meaningful issue, both down the road and immediately, but nothing's going to get done unless everybody agrees and is on the same page that this is something that is a problem. I think we saw with the coronavirus pandemic a little bit how long it took for people to acknowledge the problem, how long it took for meaningful action to really get taken. So I think that really stresses the fact that as much as a lot of environmental academics and activists love to talk about this stuff amongst ourselves, nothing really gets done unless you share what we talked about today with somebody who probably doesn't care about climate change.
That is a great bottom line. All right, Ben, Doris, and then Jim. What, if you could leave people with one thought, what would it be, Ben?
My one thought would be to beware of Star Trek. And what I mean by that is that it's very easy for us to imagine that there's a technical or technological solution to these problems. And I think that we're soaked in a world where the innovation, we have a cult of the innovator, of the disruptor, and that what we really need is a sustained political movement for a more just society where we care about the environment. And we're gonna all have to do what James said, which is we're gonna have, we say organize or die, basically. Like, we're gonna have to start building those links between people who are slightly different from us and let them link to people slightly different from them, and on and on. So we build a group of people that can counter the power of the oil sector, because that's what we're gonna need to do, because they aren't gonna design their own downfall.
Excellent point. Doris, what would you like to leave people with?
I would say get involved. Find out who your representatives are, start lobbying them, and just be that noise that, you know, they said the noise wheel get the grease. You got to make some noise. You got to get people involved that's going to make some noise to the politicians, like we do. You just got to go out there.
I love that. All right, Jim, what thought would you leave people with?
Well, I would echo what Doris just said. Really, you know, squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? You know, so the one thing I guess that, well, at least since I was on, we didn't really talk about is that the big unknown is government policy, right? So government policy is what you need to move the needle. It's not going to happen quickly enough through, you know, shareholder pressure or, you know, divestment or whatever. So, and government policy, you know, it's really hard to model. So none of the sort of the you know, the models out there about, you know, how long oil is going to continue to grow before it peaks, oil demand and turns down. That government policy can't really be effectively factored into those models because it's not known. So, and government policy depends on, you know, who we vote for and who we call and who we email and so getting involved in that, so that and, you know, because that's their job is to basically represent their constituents. So so I'd say try and push government at all levels to take it seriously.
Absolutely. I think you're kind of hearing the same message from all of us. I love the metaphor of the squeaky wheel. Be the squeaky wheel. And if you ever think that one person couldn't change the world, you never realize that one person bought a pangolin at a Chinese market and they changed the world in a bad way. But you know what? We can change the world for good. Just let me leave you with this image. Yes, we can take individual actions to reduce our personal carbon footprint. And I know a girl who did that. She convinced her entire family to stop eating meat, to stop flying, but nobody would know who she was if she hadn't done one more thing. She used her voice. She took a piece of cardboard, she painted a sign on it, she went and sat outside a building a little bit over 2 years ago. And today, because she used her voice, everybody knows her name, and her name is Greta. So the most powerful thing we can do is use our voice to advocate for change. Please join us in doing that in Texas. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Before we leave, yes, before we leave, I just want to say huge thank you to all these panelists. Y'all have been absolutely incredible. We went a little over time, but probably had some really great conversation. Especially Dr. Hayhoe, you really fielded that conversation for a while, and that was wonderful. And then finally, thank you to everyone else who joined us. We had a lot of y'all on here, and we couldn't know without y'all. So this webinar will be available at solveclimate2030.com in the coming days if you want to share it. But that's all we have, so thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate y'all.
Thanks.